Benito Mussolini was one of the most brutal dictators of the 20th century. His policies of violent repression served as inspiration to none other than Adolf Hitler, who used his Fascist Party as a model for Nazism. The Italian leader carried out dark and cruel actions to secure his rule. Beatings, murders, attacks on hospitals, nothing was too much for Il Duce. Today, in this new military history video, we will analyze Mussolini's worst atrocities, from the beginning of his regime to its violent end.
But behind all Benito Mussolini's bluster and posturing lies a dark heart of violence and brutality.
Adolf Hitler looks at Mussolini as someone who is providing a blueprint as to how to destroy the old order.
This is the story of Il Duce, the boss, and how his love of Italy inspires an epic rise to power.
As was the case with many countries in Europe, Italy found itself in a state of social discontent after the First World War. Despite being one of the victorious nations, its people felt that they did not receive the same rewards as other winners, such as the United Kingdom or France. Because of this, many of its citizens began to see the government as weak and incapable of ensuring their well-being. It was here that Benito Mussolini came on the scene. Together with his Fascist Party and taking advantage of the national situation, he emerged as a strong figure who promised to restore Italy to the glory of times past. Although his popularity grew rapidly, he was unable to secure his victory through political means. But this did not intimidate Il Duce, but only convinced him to resort to other, more violent means. By 1920, Mussolini's fascists were roaming the streets of Italy, frightening his enemies. His party had an armed wing, known as the Black Shirts, who carried out extreme measures. Socialist and communist leaders who denounced the bloody rise of Il Duce were assassinated by them, without the police or the National Army deigning to intervene. They preferred the fascists, however violent their methods, to a left-wing party. Over the years, Mussolini gained political power and social popularity, until in 1922 he decided that his time had come.
Terrified of a revolution, Italy's head of state, King Victor Emmanuel III, calls on Mussolini to lead a new coalition government. Through his ability to stir up the mob, the boss has bluffed and bullied his way to power. It's the beginning of Italy's descent into hell.
Mussolini was theoretically still a subject of King Victor Emmanuel III. However, everyone knew that the latter's power was only symbolic. The real leader of Italy was undoubtedly Il Duce, despite political opposition from some other members of the government. Throughout the 1920s, he continued to consolidate his authority, focusing first on eliminating all forms of internal opposition. Central to this were the Black Shirts, who continued their campaign of terror against the local population. The businesses and homes of opponents of fascism were vandalized or destroyed, and many militants of left-wing parties were tortured. One of the fascists' favorite methods was to force them to consume castor oil, which caused severe diarrhea and dehydration. Combined with brutal beatings, they sometimes caused infections that ended in the death of their victims. They also resorted to murder. In 1924, the socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti alleged that the fascists had resorted to intimidation and fraud to secure their victory in that year's parliamentary elections. Mussolini's secret police responded by arranging his kidnapping.
A unit of Black Shirts assaults Matteotti, who suffers a heart attack and is buried in a shallow grave just outside Rome.
With his political victory, Mussolini set in motion his plan to consolidate power. In the following years, he rendered Parliament virtually useless, passing a law declaring that it was answerable only to the king, a figure who had long since ceased to oppose his regime. At the same time, local governments were dissolved and replaced by agents loyal to the Duce. In 1928, All political parties were banned, and elections became mere staged events where the winner was predetermined. This series of tricks alarmed certain sectors of the population, but by the early 1930s, Mussolini's popular support remained massive. Many citizens believed that the solution to their problems lay in a strong, authoritarian leader. Il Duce also used a massive propaganda campaign to establish a cult of personality that set him up as a model dictator. Newspapers and radio stations were ordered to support fascist policies. Those that did not were completely censored. Once Mussolini had established himself as Italy's leading figure, he turned his sights to the international arena. One of the promises with which he had won the favor of his people was to restore Italy to the glory and prestige it had known during the Roman Empire. His attention therefore turned to the conquest of the Mediterranean Sea, one of the main sources of power of this ancient power. His first objective? Ethiopia.
Mussolini wanted to create a kind of copy of South Africa in Ethiopia. In other words, to turn the Ethiopian population into what amounted to slaves or serfs, and create a massive immigrant population of Italians who would practice a kind of apartheid.
On October 3, 1935, 350,000 of Mussolini's troops crossed the Ethiopian border from the colonies of Eritrea and Italian Somalia without a declaration of war. What followed was an extremely bloody and uneven conflict. The Europeans greatly outnumbered and out-equipped the Africans, who suffered heavy defeats in the first few months. However, the Ethiopian forces held out longer than Mussolini had anticipated. Eager to secure his victory and portray himself to the world as a conqueror, he ordered the use of chemical weapons such as mustard gas, despite them being banned by the Geneva Conventions. Attacks on civilians were also frequent, regardless of the number of casualties. In May 1936, Ethiopia's leader was forced to flee his country, and Italian forces took control of the capital. Mussolini declared that King Victor Emmanuel was now the emperor, although everyone knew who really held the power. Despite Il Duce's victory, clashes and massacres continued. Fascists intentionally attacked Red Cross hospitals that were treating their enemies, turning a deaf ear to international denunciations. Some rebel groups continued to fight for their liberation, so the Italians resorted to attacks on towns and villages as a counteroffensive. Possibly the most infamous massacre took place on February 19, 1937. Rodolfo Graziani, general in charge of the campaign and viceroy of the African colonies, suffered an assassination attempt in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. Although it was unsuccessful, Il Duce's response was terrible. For 3 days, fascist troops were given carte blanche, who unleashed terror against the civilian population, killing anyone who crossed their gun sights. The Italians mercilessly fired on groups of beggars asking for alms and burned houses with their inhabitants inside.
In addition to the gruesome executions, thousands of Ethiopians from all walks of life were consigned to inhumane detention camps located in places like Danan and Nokra. The conditions in these camps were nothing short of deplorable, with prisoners receiving only meager rations of food and water. Disease, malnutrition, and the toil of harsh labor claimed the lives of many incarcerated Ethiopians.
The massacre became known to locals as Yekatit 12, based on the date it occurred on their national calendar. But not all the deaths were random. The Italians took advantage of the chaos to round up a group of intellectuals known as the Young Ethiopians, killing many and imprisoning the rest. It is estimated that around 30,000 people died in those 3 days, but the persecutions and executions continued for weeks. In May, 3 months after his assassination attempt, Graziani claimed that the Debre Libanos monastery was involved, without any evidence. Because of this claim, more than 300 monks and acolytes were executed by Italian forces and colonial militias. Mussolini's campaign of conquest caused the deaths of almost 300,000 Ethiopians, most of them civilians. These indiscriminate killings were harshly denounced by the rest of the world. The League of Nations, the precursor to the UN, isolated Italy, which had no choice but to leave the organization. But there was one country that supported the aggressiveness shown by Il Duce: Germany.
Ethiopian War was really the beginning of the Second World War. Mussolini knew full well that invading Ethiopia, he was breaking the League of Nations. It was going to give a green light to Hitler. Hitler could now see that you could act in defiance of the League of Nations and get away with it.
Early in his political career, Adolf Hitler was a staunch admirer of the fascist leader and his iron-fisted doctrine. He even based his ideology on the foundation of his own Nazi Party. Both saw communism as a threat to Western values that had to be eliminated at the root. But once the Führer came to power in Germany, a rivalry developed over their expansionist ideas. Both Hitler and Mussolini wanted to annex Austria to their empire. However, after the war against Ethiopia and his international isolation, the Italian leader began to depend more and more on his German counterpart. He completely gave up on territorial claims with his neighbor, leaving the way clear for the Führer to annex the country in 1938. This growing bond was also reflected in Il Duce's adoption of policies that were clearly inspired by Nazi ideology. Beginning in 1938, as the alliance between the two began to strengthen, Mussolini took an anti-Semitic turn to his rhetoric. Although many of the founding members of the Fascist Party were Jews, he began to blame the Jews for many of Italy's ills. He declared them a danger to good Catholics because they were involved with the country's enemies, such as the Ethiopians and the Soviet communists. A series of anti-Semitic laws were therefore established, which prohibited mixed marriages and excluded Jews from serving in the state and the armed forces.
Italian racism is defined from 1938 onwards is increasingly in terms of Italy being defined in spiritual terms as a racial community. At the root of Italian spiritual identity is Catholicism, and therefore the Jews cannot be part of the Italian spiritual community.
Although he did not order them to be imprisoned in concentration camps as had happened in Nazi Germany, Italian policies left its Jewish population unprotected. If Hitler gained a little more influence over the fascist government, these citizens would be among his first victims. These laws were very unpopular with the local population, even non-Semites, who were already beginning to look askance at the direction the country was taking. However, Italian concerns were not only local. While Hitler prepared for the start of World War II with the annexation of Austria and part of Czechoslovakia, Mussolini also expanded his empire. On April 7, 1939, fascist troops invaded Albania, defeating his forces after only 5 days of unequal fighting. Il Duce's dominance of the Mediterranean was drawing ever closer. However, this conquest and the Ethiopian campaign showed that Italy was not prepared for a large-scale confrontation. Its victories were due primarily to the weakness of its enemies and not to the quality of its officers. The reality was that the army was undermanned, had outdated and poor quality equipment, and tactics that had not been updated since World War I. Mussolini stressed this situation to Hitler, urging him to delay his plans. However, in May 1939, the two leaders reached an agreement known as the Pact of Steel, which guaranteed armed assistance to one if the other went to war. Il Duce did not know it yet, but he had just signed his own death warrant.
Italy is decidedly unprepared for a modern world war. Its economy remains the weakest of the competing great powers. All the advice that Mussolini gets in the spring anyway of 1940 is be careful. Look, we really can't do this.
On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, starting World War II. In compliance with the pact, Italy joined the conflict the following year, while the Germans defeated France. Il Duce took advantage of the situation to continue his desire to restore the Roman Empire, invading the English colonies of Egypt and British Somalia in Africa and Greece in Europe. However, the weaknesses of the fascist army, which had already been present in the previous years, became undeniable. Italy suffered defeat after defeat, constantly having to resort to its German ally for help. The poor military performance caused Mussolini to quickly lose prestige, and his image as a strong leader was shattered. The discontent of the population was evident, and more sectors of the country called for his removal from power. Partisan movements made up of armed civilians became more frequent and began to attack his empire from within.
He began to use propaganda in an effort to blame the war on the Jews. He started to blame his generals, and when disaster really struck, he accused the Italian people of not being in control of their own dreams and objectives. It was always somebody else's fault.
La colpa era sempre degli altri.
In 1943, the Allies invaded the country, which was in no condition to defend itself. 20 days later, Il Duce was overthrown and imprisoned. Thus, Italian fascism came to an end. Mussolini managed to escape just 2 months after his arrest, but he never returned to power. Hitler established a puppet state in northern Italy and installed his ally as leader. But like King Victor Emmanuel, his power was purely symbolic. His rule was short-lived, however. On April 25, 1945, with the Allies closing in, he tried to flee to Germany with his mistress and several ministers, but only 2 days later, he was captured by partisans. In revenge for the crimes committed against the Italian people, the partisans shot him. His body was hung in a square, stoned and mutilated by the angry crowd. It is not surprising that Benito Mussolini's life came to an end with such violence. His rule was marked by massacres committed against both external enemies and his own people. The anger that he fostered for more than 2 decades through his extreme policies ended up turning against him, making it so that not even his corpse knows peace. We have reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, which of Mussolini's policies impacted you the most? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.